In the spring of 1856, a traveling photographer arrived at Willow Creek Plantation in rural Mississippi. Among the dozens of daguerreotypes he captured that week, one image would become both a family treasure and a buried secret. A photograph showing twin sisters Elizabeth and Catherine Thornwood, posed formally with an enslaved man named Samuel standing between them. The photograph, discovered in a sealed trunk in 2019, carried a handwritten note on the back. "May God forgive us what we have done." 9 months after that photograph was taken, both sisters gave birth within days of each other. The plantation records show only healthy deliveries with no mention of the fathers. What followed was a conspiracy of silence that lasted over 160 years, a secret protected by wealth, social position, and the systematic erasure of enslaved people's voices from historical record. The children born from that arrangement disappeared from official documentation, their existence scrubbed from family Bibles and census records alike. The discovery of the photograph, along with a cache of letters between the sisters and their mother, revealed a calculated plan orchestrated by the family matriarch after both daughters reached their late 20s without suitable marriage prospects. What emerged was evidence of a forced reproduction program disguised as plantation routine, a practice more common than historical records ever acknowledged, where enslaved men were coerced into fathering children for white families desperate for heirs or seeking to avoid social stigma. This is not just a story about one photograph or two sisters. It's about the systematic abuse of power on American plantations, the erasure of black families' histories, and the multi-generational trauma that persists when truth is buried. It's about Samuel, whose descendants would spend over a century searching for traces of ancestors who vanished from records, and about two mixed-race children who were likely separated from their biological father and possibly shipped to other plantations to hide the evidence. The revelation came through genealogical DNA testing in 2023, when descendants of the Thornwood family and descendants of Samuel's line discovered an unexpected genetic connection. What followed was an uncomfortable reckoning with a photograph that had hung in a private collection for decades, its true meaning carefully concealed behind composed Victorian faces and the silence of generations. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Here we unearth secrets buried by official history and give voice to what was silenced. Over 165 years ago, in a plantation mansion nestled among cotton fields in northern Mississippi, a photographer set up his equipment in the formal parlor. The year was 1856, and photography was still a novelty among wealthy plantation families, an expensive luxury reserved for those who could afford to capture their legacy in silver and glass. The Thornwood family of Willow Creek Plantation spared no expense that spring. For 3 days, the photographer worked from sunrise to dusk, capturing formal portraits of family members, servants in livery, and carefully staged scenes meant to project prosperity and refinement. Among the dozens of images created, one stood out for its unusual composition. Elizabeth and Catherine Thornwood, identical twins at 28 years old, sat side by side in matching silk dresses. Between them stood Samuel, an enslaved man in his early 30s, positioned with his hands at his sides, his gaze directed slightly away from the camera. The composition was formal, yet unsettling. The sisters' hands positioned deliberately on the arms of their chairs, Samuel's placement centrally between them suggesting something more than the typical master-servant dynamic captured in plantation photographs of that era. The photograph remained in the family's private collection for generations, passed down through descendants who displayed it in homes from Mississippi to Boston. It hung in parlors and studies, a curious Victorian artifact that prompted questions from visitors. The family's explanation remained consistent across decades. Samuel had been a trusted house servant, and the photograph commemorated his loyalty. The real story stayed locked behind that simple explanation, protected by social convention and deliberate amnesia. In 2019, Margaret Thornwood Hayes, a descendant living in Charleston, decided to donate her great-great-grandmother's trunk to the Mississippi Historical Society. Inside the leather-bound trunk wrapped in yellowed newspapers from 1857, archivists found not only the original daguerreotype, but also a collection of letters, a journal with encoded passages, and a handwritten note pinned to the back of the photograph frame. The note, written in faded brown ink, read, "May God forgive us what we have done. The children must never know their father's name. MT, December 1856. The initials matched Martha Thornwood, the twins' mother and matriarch of Willow Creek Plantation. Dr. James Morrison, A historian specializing in plantation records was called to examine the collection. What he found contradicted generations of family mythology. This wasn't a photograph commemorating loyalty, he explained to the museum board. This was documentation of ownership and control, a record of a transaction that the family wanted preserved, yet couldn't openly acknowledge. The discovery prompted immediate questions. Who was Samuel? What happened to him after the photograph was taken? And what became of the children mentioned in Martha Thornwood's note? The answers would require piecing together fragmentary records from multiple sources, plantation ledgers, church registries, and most importantly, the oral histories preserved among descendants of Willow Creek's enslaved community. Samuel's full name, as recorded in the plantation ledger, was Samuel Freeman. He had been purchased at a New Orleans auction in 1847 at age 23, described in the bill of sale as healthy, literate, skilled in carpentry and metalwork. His literacy was unusual for enslaved people of that era, a skill that would prove significant in unraveling this story. The plantation records from 1856 to 1857 showed something disturbing. In March 1856, around the time the photograph was taken, Samuel was moved from the carpentry workshop to the main house. 9 months later, in December 1856, the ledger recorded 2 entries. E.T. delivered of male child December 8th, and C.T. delivered of female child December 11th. No fathers were listed, a glaring omission in records that typically documented bloodlines meticulously when inheritance was involved. What made the discovery more haunting was what happened next. In January 1857, Samuel disappeared from Willow Creek's records entirely. The quarterly inventory that slaveholders were required to file listed his name with a single notation: transferred. No destination, no sale price, no further documentation. For all official purposes, Samuel Freeman ceased to exist. The children's fates were equally obscured. Within 2 years, neither child appeared in family records, census documents, or church baptismal registers associated with the Thornwood family. It was as if the entire episode had been methodically erased, almost. To understand how this arrangement came to be, we must look beyond the photograph to the person who orchestrated it. Martha Thornwood, widow and absolute authority at Willow Creek Plantation. Martha had been widowed in 1852 when her husband, Colonel Richard Thornwood, died from complications of influenza. At 54 years old, she found herself managing a 2,000-acre cotton plantation with over 60 enslaved workers, significant debts from her late husband's gambling habits, and 2 unmarried daughters approaching 30, an age considered dangerously close to spinsterhood in 1850s Southern society. Letters between Martha and her sister, discovered in the same trunk as the photograph, reveal the depth of her desperation. In an 1855 letter, Martha wrote, "Catherine's prospects grow dimmer with each season. Elizabeth fares no better. The gentlemen of suitable station seek younger brides, and our circumstances, though respectable, cannot compete with dowries from Mobile or Natchez. I fear the family line will die with them, and Willow Creek will pass to Richard's nephew, who cares nothing for our legacy." Southern society in the 1850s placed tremendous pressure on women to marry and produce heirs. For plantation families, marriage wasn't merely romantic, it was economic survival and social standing. Unmarried women past 30 faced social marginalization and uncertain futures, often becoming dependents in relatives' households. But Martha Thornwood wasn't willing to accept that fate for her daughters or her plantation. According to entries in her private journal, portions of which were written in a simple substitution cipher, she devised what she called a solution that protects both propriety and necessity. The journal entries from late 1855 reveal her thought process. "The neighboring families whisper about my daughters," she wrote in November 1855. "They say Catherine is too bookish, Elizabeth too particular. But I know the truth. Suitable men do not call because we lack the dowry to compete with Charleston families. Yet what if my daughters could present heirs? What if society believed them widowed young, or that their children came from brief, tragic marriages?" The plan that emerged was both calculated and monstrous. Martha would arrange for her daughters to become pregnant through forced arrangements with an enslaved man, someone who could be controlled through the absolute power dynamics of slavery, who had no legal standing to claim paternity, and who could be removed from the plantation once his purpose was served. The selection of Samuel Freeman appears to have been deliberate. Plantation correspondence from early 1856 shows Martha making inquiries about enslaved men on the property who were of refined appearance and showing intelligence beyond common field hands. Samuel, with his literacy, carpentry skills, and lighter complexion, he was described in sale documents as mulatto, fit her requirements. What makes this case particularly disturbing is the documentation that survived. Unlike most instances of sexual exploitation on plantations, which were hidden, unrecorded, and unacknowledged, Martha Thornwood kept meticulous records. She seemed to believe she was solving a practical problem, applying plantation logic to her personal crisis. Her journal reveals no awareness of the moral horror of her plan, only concern about maintaining social respectability and securing heirs. The photograph itself may have been part of that plan. In an era when photography was expensive and meaningful, having Samuel posed between the twins might have served as private documentation, proof of the arrangement for legal purposes or family records, while remaining ambiguous enough to outsiders. The formal composition suggested authority and control rather than intimacy, maintaining the fiction of proper social boundaries even while documenting their violation. Letters between Martha and a New Orleans attorney, dated March 1856, discuss arrangements for ensuring legal clarity regarding inheritance rights of future grandchildren, and the necessity of documentary evidence that could withstand scrutiny should questions arise. The attorney's responses, carefully worded, suggested he understood the nature of Martha's plan, while avoiding explicit acknowledgement that would put him at legal risk. By May 1856, according to the plantation ledger, Samuel had been permanently reassigned from the carpentry workshop to the main house, listed as attending to special duties as directed by Mistress Thornwood. This reassignment isolated him from the quarters where other enslaved workers lived, placing him under direct control of the family. What remains unknown, what no journal entry or letter explicitly documents, is whether Elizabeth and Catherine Thornwood were willing participants in their mother's plan, or coerced participants in a different sense. Were they desperate enough to comply, or did Martha's authority over her daughters mirror the absolute control she exercised over enslaved workers? The sisters left no letters expressing their own feelings, only obedience to their mother's orchestrations. The period between the photograph's creation in March 1856 and the births in December 1856 was marked by deliberate isolation and careful management of information. Plantation records and correspondence from this period reveal a household operating under unusual restrictions. Willow Creek Plantation typically received frequent visitors, neighboring plantation families, merchants from Tupelo, and distant relatives passing through Mississippi, but between April and December 1856, social engagements virtually ceased. Martha Thornwood sent letters to neighboring families claiming her daughters were suffering from delicate constitutions requiring rest and seclusion. Dr. William Hastings, the physician who attended wealthy families in the area, made regular visits to Willow Creek during this period. His account book, preserved at the Mississippi Medical History Museum, shows bi-weekly visits to attend to Miss E. Thornwood and Miss C. Thornwood, with notations of tonic prescribed for nervous disposition and bed rest recommended. These entries continued from May through November 1856. What's significant about Dr. Hastings's records is what they don't explicitly state. He never recorded the word pregnancy or expecting, despite what must have been obvious by midsummer. This omission wasn't accidental. For unmarried women of the Thornwood sisters' social class, pregnancy outside marriage was scandalous enough to destroy reputations permanently. The physician's discretion was purchased through generous fees, and perhaps the understanding that some things were better left unwritten. During these months, Samuel remained in the main house, isolated from the enslaved community in the quarters. According to testimony collected in the 1930s by the Works Progress Administration from elderly former slaves, Samuel's absence was noted and discussed quietly among enslaved workers. One testimony from Clara Washington, who had been enslaved at Willow Creek as a child, recalled, "My mama told me that Samuel the carpenter stopped coming to the workshops. The older folks said he was up at the big house, and they spoke of it in whispers. When I asked why, Mama just shook her head and said some things children shouldn't ask about." The enforced silence around Samuel's situation reflects a broader pattern on plantations where enslaved men were used in forced reproduction schemes. Unlike the more commonly documented sexual exploitation of enslaved women by white men, which, while horrifying, fit within the twisted logic of absolute property rights, using enslaved men to impregnate white women violated fundamental taboos of both racial and sexual order in antebellum South. Such arrangements had to be completely hidden to avoid social catastrophe for the white families involved. Letters between Martha Thornwood and her sister in Mobile during this period show careful word crafting. In a June 1856 letter, Martha wrote, "The girls remain indoors, following Dr. Hastings' recommendations. I am hopeful that by winter our difficulties will be resolved in a manner that preserves dignity and ensures the future." Her sister's response acknowledged, "You are braver than I could be in your circumstances. May Providence protect what you endeavor to accomplish." As autumn approached and the twins' conditions became impossible to hide from household staff, Martha took additional measures. In September 1856, she dismissed 2 long-serving house servants, replacing them with younger enslaved women who had no history with the family and thus no basis for comparison to previous years. This deliberate turnover of staff appears designed to limit the number of witnesses who could piece together the full story. The plantation overseer's reports from this period, maintained in the Mississippi State Archives, show no unusual notations, evidence that whatever was happening in the main house was successfully compartmentalized from the routine operation of cotton cultivation and enslaved labor management. What we know of Samuel's experience during these months comes only from inference and later testimonies. He had no voice in contemporary records, no diary to document his thoughts, no letters to express his feelings about being used as an instrument in Martha Thornwood's plan. The complete absence of his perspective is itself a documentation of power. He existed in these records only as a function, a tool, never as a person with agency or emotions worth recording. Now I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're hearing this story. I want to know how far these silenced accounts reach. Winter arrived early in northern Mississippi in 1856, bringing cold rains and early darkness. On December 8th, as a storm battered Willow Creek Plantation, Elizabeth Thornwood went into labor. 3 days later, on December 11th, her twin sister Catherine followed. Both births occurred in the main house attended by Dr. Hastings and midwives brought in from outside the immediate area, women who had no connection to local families and could be paid for discretion. The plantation ledger recorded the events with clinical brevity. December 8, 1856. E.T. delivered of male child, healthy. December 11, 1856. C.T. delivered of female child, healthy. No fathers were named. No baptisms were scheduled. The children remained unnamed in any official record associated with the Thornwood family. Dr. Hastings' medical notes, discovered decades later among papers donated by his grandson to a university archive, provided slightly more detail. For Elizabeth's delivery, he noted, labor progressed normally. Infant male, approximately 7 pounds, vigorous cry. Patient recovering well. Have advised extended rest and privacy. For Catherine's delivery 3 days later. Labor brief, infant female, approximately 6 pounds. Patient fatigued but stable. Both infants show characteristics requiring special arrangements as discussed with MT. That final phrase, characteristics requiring special arrangements, was the only acknowledgement in Dr. Hastings' otherwise straightforward medical documentation that these children's appearances complicated the family's plans. The physician understood without stating explicitly that infants born of mixed-race parentage would show physical features that couldn't be hidden or explained away in white Southern society of the 1850s. Letters between Martha Thornwood and her attorney in New Orleans, dated December 15th and 20th, 1856, discussed implementing the secondary provisions we discussed regarding placement of the infants, and ensuring documentation that protects the family while providing for the children's welfare. The attorney's response advised, given the circumstances, immediate placement with appropriate families would best serve all interests. I have contacted associates who can facilitate discreet arrangements. What these carefully worded letters revealed was a backup plan. Martha Thornwood had hoped her grandchildren might be light-skinned enough to be raised as her daughter's adopted wards, perhaps with a story of deceased soldier fathers or mysterious brief marriages. But when the infants were born with features that clearly indicated mixed ancestry, that plan collapsed. New arrangements had to be made urgently. The human tragedy buried in these administrative details is almost unbearable to contemplate. Elizabeth and Catherine Thornwood had given birth to their own children, children they would never be allowed to raise, children whose existence would be erased from family records, children who would be taken from them within weeks or days of birth. Did the sisters hold their infants? Did they name them privately, even if those names were never recorded? Did they weep when the children were carried away? The historical record gives us nothing. Their experiences, their grief, their trauma exist only as gaps in the documentation, as silences that speak volumes about whose pain mattered enough to record in antebellum America. For Samuel, the births meant something even more devastating. He had been used as an instrument to father children who would now be torn from him, without his having any legal standing to object, any social position to demand recognition, any voice to protest. His children, a son and a daughter, would vanish into a system designed to erase their origins and his connection to them. Testimony collected by the WPA in the 1930s from descendants of Willow Creek's enslaved community preserved a fragment of this story. James Freeman, who identified himself as Samuel Freeman's great-nephew, told an interviewer, "Family Stories said Samuel was a proud man, educated himself to read and write. After those babies were born, something broke in him. The old folks said he tried to see them one time and they punished him for it. After that, he went quiet, stopped talking much to anybody." The punishment James Freeman referenced appears in the plantation overseer's log, dated December 22, 1856. Samuel, house servant, reprimanded for insubordination and confined to quarters for 2 days, bread and water only. No details were provided about what constituted insubordination, but the timing, less than 2 weeks after the births, suggests Samuel attempted to assert some connection to the children or protested the arrangements being made. By December 28, 1856, Dr. Hastings' final notation about the Thornwood sisters appeared in his records. Both patients recovering appropriately. Recommended continued rest and gradual return to normal activities by February. Special arrangements completed as directed. The infants disappear from Willow Creek's records entirely after late December 1856. No further mentions appear in plantation documents, family correspondence, or local church records. It's as if they had never existed, which in the world Martha Thornwood was determined to preserve, was precisely the point. In January 1857, less than 6 weeks after the births, Samuel Freeman vanished from Willow Creek Plantation's records with a single word: transferred. The quarterly inventory that Mississippi law required slaveholders to file listed his name alongside livestock and equipment, marked with that cryptic notation and nothing more. Transferred could mean many things in the context of slavery. It might indicate sale to another plantation, relocation to a different property owned by the same family, or lease to a business or industry. But the absence of any sale price, destination, or receiving party in the documentation suggests something more deliberate, an erasure rather than a simple transaction. Plantation records from surrounding counties show no evidence of Samuel Freeman being purchased or registered anywhere in Mississippi between 1857 and 1860. His name doesn't appear in auction records, bills of sale, or estate inventories from the region. It's as if he simply ceased to exist in any official capacity. Research by historian Dr. Patricia Henderson, who has spent decades tracing enslaved people's movements through fragmentary records, suggests several possibilities for Samuel's fate. When an enslaved person disappears from records so completely, especially after being involved in something that needed to be hidden, we have to consider darker explanations, Dr. Henderson explained in a 2021 interview. He may have been sold to traders heading west or south, deliberately sent far enough away that he could never return or make claims. Or he may have met an even worse fate that was never recorded at all. Some evidence suggests Samuel may have been sold to a cotton broker in Natchez, who supplied labor to plantations in Texas, a common route for removing enslaved people from areas where their presence was problematic. A notation in a Natchez merchant's ledger from February 1857 references one male Negro, carpenter, literate, age approximately 32, condition fair, being shipped west. The description matches Samuel, but no name confirms the connection definitively. Oral histories preserved in the African American community descended from Willow Creek's enslaved population offer a darker possibility. Multiple testimonies collected in the 1930s and again in the 1970s reference a story about a skilled carpenter who knew too much about the big house secrets and disappeared after trouble with the mistress. One account specifically names Samuel Freeman and suggests he might have been killed to ensure his silence. Clara Washington, whose testimony was recorded by the WPA in 1937, told interviewers, "My grandmother said Samuel was a smart man who could read and write better than most white folks. She said after he disappeared there were whispers about a body found in the woods near the old creek, but nobody dared talk about it openly. The patrollers, Those white men who kept us in line, they made sure nobody asked questions. Whether Samuel was sold away or met a violent end, the result was the same. He was removed from the story, his voice silenced, his existence reduced to a few lines in account books. He would never see his children again, never know what became of them, never have any opportunity to claim even the limited forms of fatherhood that enslaved men could sometimes exercise. The cruelty extends beyond Samuel's own fate. By erasing him from the record so completely, Martha Thornwood and whoever assisted in his removal ensured that his descendants, both the children born that December and any other children he may have fathered before, would have no way to trace their lineage, no way to know their father's name, no way to piece together their own family history. This deliberate fragmentation of black families was one of slavery's most devastating tools. Unlike white families who maintained detailed genealogies and passed down stories across generations, enslaved people's family connections were routinely severed and erased. Parents were sold away from children, siblings separated, names forgotten or deliberately obscured. Samuel's disappearance wasn't unique. It was part of a systematic destruction of black family histories that affects genealogical research even today. What happened to the relationship Samuel might have had before being moved to the main house in 1856? Plantation records from earlier years mention marriages among enslaved workers at Willow Creek, but these informal unions had no legal standing and were routinely ignored when they conflicted with slaveholders' interests. If Samuel had a partner or children among the enslaved community, they too were erased from the story, their loss and grief unrecorded. The broader impact of Samuel's removal rippled through Willow Creek's enslaved community. His disappearance would have served as a warning, a demonstration of what happened to those who became inconvenient to the planter family, no matter how skilled or valued they might have been. The message was clear. No one was safe from being discarded or eliminated when the white family's interests demanded it. While Samuel vanished into the cruel machinery of slavery's forced migrations, the two infants born in December 1856 faced their own form of erasure. Martha Thornwood's carefully constructed plan required not just removing Samuel, but also ensuring the children could never be traced back to Willow Creek or her daughters. Letters between Martha and her New Orleans attorney reveal the mechanisms of this disappearance. In a January 1857 letter marked confidential, the attorney wrote, "I have secured appropriate placements for both children through intermediaries who ask no questions and keep no permanent records. The male infant has been placed with a freed woman in Baton Rouge who operates a small boarding house and has agreed to raise the child as her own. The female infant goes to a family in Mobile with connections to the colored community there. Payment has been arranged through third parties to ensure no direct link to your family. These appropriate placements meant the children would be raised as black or mixed race, integrated into free black communities or enslaved populations, completely severed from their biological mothers and any knowledge of their white ancestry." For Martha Thornwood, this solved the immediate problem of mixed-race grandchildren who couldn't be acknowledged. But for the children themselves, it meant growing up with fabricated identities, never knowing their true origins. The practice of placing mixed-race children born to white women in black communities was more common than historical records typically acknowledge, though the documentation is deliberately sparse. These arrangements required discretion, money, and connections, all of which Martha Thornwood possessed. Freed black women or enslaved people in urban areas might be paid or coerced into taking in infants and raising them as foundlings or adopted children. What makes this case particularly haunting is what happened to Elizabeth and Catherine Thornwood after their children were taken. Letters between the sisters and their mother from 1857 through 1859 never mention the births or the children, a conspicuous absence in correspondence that otherwise discussed household matters in detail. The silence suggests either that the sisters were forbidden from acknowledging what happened, or that the trauma was too profound to put into words. Medical records show both sisters suffered from what Dr. Hastings diagnosed as melancholia and nervous exhaustion throughout 1857. Elizabeth was prescribed laudanum for persistent distress and inability to sleep, while Catherine was advised to take extended rest cure with minimal stimulation. These Victorian-era diagnoses likely masked what we would now recognize as symptoms of severe depression and possibly post-traumatic stress following the forced separation from their newborn children. Neither sister ever married or had other children. They remained at Willow Creek Plantation with their mother until Martha's death in 1869, then together until Elizabeth died in 1881 and Catherine in 1883. Census records show them living quietly, listed as unmarried women managing a declining plantation in an economically devastated post-Civil War South. The Civil War and Reconstruction period, 1861-1877, created upheaval that might have allowed the sisters to search for their children, but no evidence suggests they ever tried. By the time slavery ended and legal frameworks changed, their children would have been young adults with established identities in other communities. Finding them would have required acknowledging the circumstances of their births, something that remained unthinkable in Southern white society even after the war. What about the children themselves? Did they know any truth about their origins? The fragmentary evidence we have suggests they lived and died without ever learning their biological mother's identities. Genealogical research conducted in 2023 by descendants working with Ancestry DNA Services located potential connections. A woman named Sarah Collins, who lived in Mobile until her death in 1924, may have been the daughter born to Catherine Thornwood in December 1856. Census records show Sarah was raised by a free black family, the Davidsons, who ran a small shop. She married, had children, and lived what appeared to be a respectable middle-class life in Mobile's black community. The potential son, more difficult to trace, may have been a man named James Freeman, who worked as a carpenter in Baton Rouge and later New Orleans. His surname, Freeman, might have been adopted by the woman who raised him, or it might have been a deliberate choice to honor his biological father, whose name perhaps survived in whispered family stories. James died in 1911, leaving descendants who scattered across Louisiana and Texas. If this story has gripped you so far, leave a like. It helps the story of Samuel Freeman and his children reach more people. For over 160 years, the truth about the photograph, the births, and Samuel Freeman's fate remained locked in family archives and oral traditions that were carefully controlled or systematically ignored. The silence that Martha Thornwood imposed in 1856-1857 proved remarkably durable, surviving the Civil War, Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Movement, and into the 21st century. How does a secret this profound stay hidden for so many generations? The answer lies in the intersection of shame, power, and the systematic devaluation of black people's stories in American historical record-keeping. For the Thornwood family descendants, the photograph remained a curiosity, an odd Victorian composition that prompted questions but never deep investigation. Family stories painted Martha Thornwood as a strong woman who preserved the plantation during difficult times, Elizabeth and Catherine as devoted daughters who never married but lived quiet, respectable lives. Samuel, if mentioned at all, was a trusted house servant, his humanity reduced to a function. The letters and journal that revealed the truth stayed sealed in Martha's trunk, passed down through generations as old family papers that descendants never thoroughly examined. Margaret Thornwood Hayes, who finally donated the trunk to the Mississippi Historical Society in 2019, told researchers she had inherited it from her mother without ever opening it. Mom said it was just old letters and photographs, things that belonged in a museum rather than gathering dust in our attic, Margaret explained. Why didn't the African American community descendants of Willow Creek speak more openly about what happened? Oral histories preserved in the 1930s and 1970s show that stories about Samuel and the Big House Secret did circulate, but always cautiously, always with awareness of who might be listening. The reality of living in the Jim Crow South meant that challenging white families' official narratives was dangerous. Even after legal slavery ended, social, economic, and physical intimidation kept black communities from openly contradicting stories that white families wanted told. Genealogical research that might expose white families' secrets could result in job loss, violence, or other retaliation. Dr. Marcus Williams, a historian specializing in African American genealogy in the South, explained in a 2020 interview, black families preserved their histories orally because written records were too dangerous. If you wrote down that your ancestor was the child of a white plantation owner, that document could be used against you, to deny inheritance, to question your legitimacy, to expose family connections that white relatives wanted hidden. So stories stayed in memory, passed from grandmother to grandchild in private conversations. The systematic gaps in official records also played a role. Enslaved people's births, deaths, and family relationships were poorly documented or deliberately obscured. When the Freedmen's Bureau tried to help formerly enslaved people register marriages and locate family members after the Civil War, they found that plantation records often listed enslaved people only by first names, ages, and value. not by family groupings or parentage. For descendants of Samuel Freeman, tracing their ancestry back before 1865 proved nearly impossible. His name appeared in a few plantation ledgers, but the records deliberately provided no information about his life before being purchased in 1847, whether he had parents or siblings at other plantations, or what happened to him after January 1857. His children by the Thornwood sisters had no documentation linking them to him at all. The photograph itself, hanging in various Thornwood family homes, was effectively hidden in plain sight. Without the context provided by Martha's letters and journal, it appeared to be just another formal Victorian portrait. The contemporary viewer might notice the unusual composition. A black man posed between two white women, but without the documentary evidence, there was no way to know what the image really captured. Academic historians who studied plantation records in Mississippi occasionally noted the oddity of Samuel's abrupt disappearance from Willow Creek's ledgers, but with thousands of enslaved people being bought, sold, and transferred constantly, one carpenter's removal didn't prompt deep investigation. The births of Elizabeth and Catherine's children, never officially connected to them by name and quickly removed from the plantation, left no obvious trail in conventional historical sources. It took the convergence of several modern developments to finally break the silence. The donation of Martha Thornwood's trunk to a professional archive, where historians could examine it systematically. The development of genetic genealogy services that allowed descendants of different family lines to discover unexpected connections, and the growing movement to center enslaved people's stories and experiences in historical research rather than treating them as background to white families' narratives. The unraveling of the Thornwood sisters' secret began not with historical documents, but with commercial DNA testing in the early 2020s. Two people who had never heard of each other and lived hundreds of miles apart submitted DNA samples to an ancestry service and discovered they shared significant genetic connections that contradicted their family trees entirely. Rebecca Turner, a 34-year-old teacher living in Atlanta, had submitted her DNA hoping to learn more about her African-American heritage and possibly connect with distant cousins. Her results showed the expected West African ancestry, along with significant European admixture, common in African-American genealogy, due to the widespread sexual exploitation during slavery. What surprised Rebecca was a close genetic match labeled first, second cousin, with someone named Daniel Thornwood, whose profile identified him as white with primarily British and Irish ancestry. Genealogy guides explain that sharing this much DNA typically indicates a great-grandparent connection. Rebecca sent a cautious message through the service's platform. This seems like an unusually close match. Do you have any knowledge of your family tree that might explain our connection? Daniel Thornwood, a 42-year-old architect in Boston, was equally puzzled. His family tree was meticulously documented back to the 1700s. Plantation owners, merchants, Confederate officers during the Civil War. There was no indication of any black ancestry or family connections in the genealogies his grandmother had compiled in the 1970s. After months of correspondence and comparing family trees, Rebecca and Daniel hit upon a troubling possibility. DNA analysis showed that they shared ancestry on Rebecca's paternal line going back to her great-great-grandfather, James Freeman, a carpenter in New Orleans who died in 1911. Daniel's family tree included Elizabeth and Catherine Thornwood, unmarried sisters who had lived at Willow Creek Plantation in Mississippi. The DNA evidence suggested that James Freeman and the Thornwood sisters shared a close genetic connection, close enough that James might have been their biological child or nephew. But how? Rebecca's family had always been told that James's mother was a free black woman in Baton Rouge who raised him alone. Daniel's family record stated explicitly that the Thornwood sisters never married or had children. Rebecca reached out to genealogy research groups specializing in African American history. One researcher suggested looking for any documentation about Willow Creek Plantation during the 1850s, census records, plantation ledgers, sale documents. Another recommended checking historical societies in Mississippi for any materials donated by Thornwood family descendants. That search led to the Mississippi Historical Society, where in 2019, Margaret Thornwood Hayes had recently donated her great-great-grandmother's trunk. When archivists heard about Rebecca's inquiry, they connected her with Dr. James Morrison, the historian who had examined Martha Thornwood's letters and journal 2 years earlier. Dr. Morrison had been waiting for something like this. When I first read Martha Thornwood's letters and decoded portions of her journal, I knew this was an explosive historical case, he explained in a 2023 interview. But without living descendants to confirm the story through DNA evidence, it remained just historical documentation of a terrible crime. Rebecca and Daniel's connection provided the final proof. The DNA results, combined with the documentary evidence from the trunk, reconstructed the story. James Freeman, Rebecca's great-great-grandfather, was almost certainly the son born to Elizabeth Thornwood in December 1856. His father was Samuel Freeman, the enslaved carpenter who disappeared from Willow Creek's records in January 1857. The surname James used, Freeman, may have been adopted by his adoptive mother, or may have been a deliberate choice to preserve his father's name. Daniel Thornwood's connection came through his direct descent from Elizabeth Thornwood's brother, who inherited Willow Creek Plantation after the sisters' deaths. Daniel was related to Elizabeth as her great-great-great-nephew, making James Freeman his distant cousin through Elizabeth's maternal genetics. The revelation sent ripples through both family lines. For Rebecca, it explained genetic markers that had seemed contradictory and provided documentation of an ancestor whose origins had been murky family legend. For Daniel, it shattered assumptions about his family's history and forced a reckoning with the reality that his ancestors had participated in forced reproduction and systematic erasure of black family connections. Other DNA matches began appearing as genetic databases expanded. A woman in Mobile named Jennifer Collins discovered she shared DNA with both the Thornwood descendants and James Freeman's line. Further research suggested Jennifer might descend from Sarah Collins, the woman raised by the Davidson family in Mobile, possibly the daughter born to Catherine Thornwood in December 1856. By 2024, genetic genealogists had identified at least 15 living people with direct genetic connections to the children born to the Thornwood sisters in 1856. Most had no previous knowledge of this aspect of their heritage. Several had family stories about mystery ancestors, or family secrets that were never discussed, but none had imagined a story this complex. The scientific evidence was overwhelming. DNA doesn't lie about genetic relationships, even when historical records have been deliberately falsified or destroyed. What Martha Thornwood thought she had buried forever remained encoded in the genomes of descendants who lived more than 160 years after her carefully orchestrated cover-up. In 2024, descendants from both sides of this story, those tracing ancestry to the Thornwood sisters and those descended from Samuel Freeman and the children born in 1856, gathered for a remarkable meeting at the Mississippi Historical Society. What brought them together was both DNA evidence and a shared commitment to confronting uncomfortable truths about American history. The gathering included 37 people across 4 generations, ranging from elderly descendants who remembered family whispers about plantation secrets to young adults just learning about their genetic heritage through testing services. Among them were teachers, engineers, nurses, artists, a minister, 2 historians, and several retired military veterans, a cross-section of American life connected by events from 168 years earlier. Rebecca Turner and Daniel Thornwood, whose DNA match had catalyzed the broader investigation, spoke about what the revelations meant to them. Learning that my great-great-grandfather James Freeman was the child of an enslaved man and a white plantation owner's daughter fundamentally changed how I understand my family history, Rebecca said. It's not just that this happened, it's that it was so carefully hidden, so systematically erased. How many other families have similar stories buried in silence? Daniel Thornwood described his own difficult reckoning. I grew up with stories about Willow Creek as this grand plantation, the Thornwood family as sophisticated people who preserved culture in difficult times. Learning what Martha Thornwood orchestrated, what my ancestors did to Samuel Freeman and those children, was devastating. There's no way to make it right, but acknowledging it honestly is the minimum we owe. The historical evidence laid bare at this gathering told a story that textbooks often gloss over or omit entirely. Slavery wasn't just about forced labor in cotton fields. It was about total control over human bodies, reproduction, and family structures. Martha Thornwood's plan to use Samuel Freeman to provide heirs for her daughters wasn't an isolated incident, but part of broader patterns of sexual exploitation and forced reproduction that shaped American slavery. Dr. Patricia Henderson, who had researched Samuel Freeman's disappearance, presented findings about similar cases she had discovered in plantation records across the South. What happened at Willow Creek wasn't unique, she explained to the assembled descendants. We found at least 20 documented cases in Mississippi alone, where enslaved men were used in forced reproduction schemes involving white women, usually to provide heirs, sometimes to avoid marriages that families found unacceptable, sometimes for reasons that remain obscure. In almost every case, the enslaved man was removed or killed afterward, and the children were placed in black communities with fabricated origins. The gathering also addressed the question that haunted all participants: what became of Samuel Freeman? Despite extensive research, his fate after January 1857 remains uncertain. The most hopeful scenario has him surviving and living under a different name, perhaps in Texas or further west. The darker possibilities, death by violence or brutal working conditions in industries that consumed enslaved men's lives quickly, cannot be ruled out. What's certain is that Samuel never had any opportunity to know his children, to see them grow, to pass on his name or his story. The carpentry skills he possessed, the literacy he had somehow acquired against overwhelming odds, the humanity that archivists glimpsed in fragmentary records, all of it was supposed to disappear when Martha Thornwood wrote "transferred" in the plantation ledger. For descendants of Samuel and the children born in December 1856, the DNA evidence and historical documentation provided something precious, proof of ancestry that slavery had tried to erase. Genetic genealogy allowed them to reclaim family connections and identities that no amount of traditional document research could establish. Given how systematically those connections had been obscured, the broader implications extend beyond one family's story. This case demonstrates how thoroughly slavery disrupted black families and how those disruptions continue affecting descendants today. The inability to trace ancestry, the missing documentation, the gaps in family trees where enslaved ancestors should appear. These aren't just historical curiosities. They represent ongoing harm from policies designed to treat black people as property, rather than people with families, histories, and inherent dignity. The descendants made collective decisions about how to honor those who suffered. They established a memorial fund to support genealogical research for other families struggling to document enslaved ancestors. They worked with the Mississippi Historical Society to create an exhibit about Willow Creek Plantation that centers Samuel Freeman's story, rather than treating him as a footnote to the Thornwood family narrative. And they committed to sharing this history publicly, refusing the silence that Martha Thornwood tried to impose. Jennifer Collins, who likely descends from the daughter born to Catherine Thornwood, spoke about what discovering this heritage meant to her. "I grew up knowing my family had roots in Mobile going back generations, but we could never trace further than my great-great-grandmother Sarah. Now I know why, because her origins were deliberately hidden. Learning this truth is painful, but it's also powerful." Sarah Collins survived despite everything designed to erase her. We survive because she did. The photograph that started as evidence of Martha Thornwood's plan now hangs in the Mississippi Historical Society with a new placard. Instead of identifying it as Thornwood sisters with house servant, the label reads, "Elizabeth and Catherine Thornwood with Samuel Freeman, 1856. This photograph documents a forced reproduction scheme at Willow Creek Plantation. Samuel Freeman disappeared from records in January 1857. 2 children born to the Thornwood sisters in December 1856 were placed with black families and denied knowledge of their origins. Their descendants reunited through DNA testing in 2023. The story of the Thornwood sisters, Samuel Freeman, and the children born in December 1856 isn't just history. It's living memory preserved in DNA, in family stories passed down through careful whispers, in documents that survived only by accident. It reminds us that slavery's violence extended far beyond the immediate pain of forced labor, leaving wounds that persist across generations in the severed family connections, the erased identities, the systematic silencing of black people's humanity. What Martha Thornwood thought she could bury forever survived because truth has a stubborn way of emerging, even after 168 years. The photograph she commissioned to document her plan became the evidence that exposed it. The children she tried to erase lived, had descendants, and passed on genetic connections that no amount of falsified records could obliterate. For every case like this, where DNA evidence and historical documents converge to reveal truth, thousands more remain hidden in silence, lost to gaps in documentation, or buried too deeply to recover. But each story uncovered matters. It restores humanity to people who were treated as property, gives voice to experiences that were systematically silenced, and forces descendants on all sides to confront uncomfortable truths about how American society was built. The descendants who gathered in 2024 continue their work, knowing that reconciliation with this history is ongoing, not a single moment of acknowledgement. They honor Samuel Freeman not just by discovering what happened to him, but by refusing to let his humanity be reduced to a single traumatic episode. He was a skilled carpenter, a literate man in an era when that was dangerous for enslaved people, someone who tried to claim connection to his children even when doing so brought punishment. His life mattered beyond the terrible circumstances that brought him into the Thornwood sisters' story. Subscribe to this channel to discover more forbidden and forgotten stories. Thank you for following the case of Samuel Freeman and Willow Creek Plantation. See you in the next video.